We're up to Daf Mem Amid Beis, but let's just take a look at the last line on Mem Amid Alf. The Mishnah says, with regard to Shnios LaRayos, and whether that Gzera applies even to Chalutza or only to an Erva Doraisa, HaCholitz Liyavimto, who, meaning the Cholitz, Asur B'Krovoseh. He's not allowed to marry any of the Krovos of his Chalutza. It's as if she was his wife. He divorced her. And when you divorce a woman, you're not allowed to marry any of her relatives, her mother, her daughter, her sister. What's the status of a Chalutza? And the Mishnah Paskin Asur B'Krovoseh. Fehi Asur B'Krovo. And she's not allowed to marry, she the Chalutza, any of his relatives. And here we turn to Daf Mem Amid Beis. Who Asur B'Krovoseha, the Cholis can't marry any of her relatives, Be'ima, and then Be'em Ima. That's his wife's grandmother, who's basically the mother of his mother-in-law. That's called Eim Ima. Ube'em Aviha, which is like the mother of his father-in-law, so that's the mother of his wife's father. Ubebita, Ubebas Bita, Ubebas Bina, Bachosa, Bisman Shi Kayemis, as long as the Chalutz is alive. And v'ha'achin, as far as the other brothers is concerned, other than the Cholitz, Mutarin, they weren't involved in the Chalitza, therefore they could marry the Krovos of the Chalutza. The Rabbanan did not prohibit the Krovos of a Chalutza except because the Chalitza is like Gerish, and therefore that's limited only to the Cholitz and not to the other brothers. And now we flip it around. He and she, the Chalutza, is Asura bi Aviv, the father of the Yavam, and that's called Ervas Kaloso. Truth is that Isur was applicable even before Chalitza, and that's called Kaloso. Biavi Aviv, her Cholitz's grandfather, meaning paternal grandfather, which is the father of the father-in-law, meaning to whom the Kaloso, so it's like Kalas Bino. The grandfather is Kalas Bino. And these are all Shnios LaRayos. Bibno, she cannot marry the son of the Cholitz. It's also Mirabanon. And that's called Isur Eshes Av. But only Mirabanan, because she's considered like each. Then we have Ben Beno, we have Ba'achiv, and Ube Ben Achiv. Now, Ben Achiv is the same as Eshes Achi Aviv. And this is all because she's considered like an Asua to the Cholitz, Midrabanan. Mutar Adam V'Krovas Saras Chalusas. So here we have the following scenario. We have Shimon is married to Leah and Sarah. Shimon dies. His wives Leah and Sarah fall for Yimum or Chalitza, and Reuven, the brother of Shimon, does Chalitza to the wife Leah, the Leah who is the wife of his late brother. Now, Sarah is Sarah's Chalutza, so she's the Tzara of Leah, the Chalutza, and she's also enjoined from a relationship with Reuven. However, the relatives of Sarah, who's the Tzara, I'm not talking about the relatives of Leah, who's the Chalutza, but rather the relatives of Sarah are allowed to marry Reuven. So it means that even though the Chachamim said that Tsaras Chalutza is Asura, they didn't institute that Gzera to prohibit even the Krovos of the Chalutza. I'm sorry, they didn't institute this Gzera to prohibit the Krovos of the Tsaras Chalutza, but only of the Krovos of the Chalutza itself. The Asa Bekrovos Chalutzas. Iboilu, the Gemara asks, Gazu Shnios Bechalutza Olo. Would it be a Gzera on top of a Gzera for the Chachamim to, number one, prohibit the Chalutzas if she was a Grusha? This guy. And on top of that, they add Shnios. Olo. Or should say no. B'erva Doraisa goes Rabbanon Shnios. So if a violation of Shnios could lead to an Erva Doraisa, that's why the Rabbanon prohibited Shnios. But here in this case, B'chalutza, Lo Gozu Be Rabbanon Shnios, because even in the worst case scenario, the Krovos themselves are only Midrabbanon. Odilma well, shall we say that once the Rabbanan made a takana, upgrading the status of Chalutza to a Grusha, then all the repercussions fit into place as if she were a Grusha. And Shnios apply as well. Toshma, let's look at our Mishnah. Hu aser be'ima be'em ima. He's not allowed to marry his Chalutza's grandmother because a grandmother is an Erva Doraisa. And the Rabbanan would go through in Chalutza. Ve'ilu eim ima, the implication of the Mishnah Lokatani would be the great-grandmother, and that would imply that the Rabbanan did not aser Shnios in a Chalutza. The grandmother is an Erva Doraisa, but the great-grandmother is only Chalutza. Is only the Rabbanan. So Gemara rejects the Dilma. In truth, even aim ima would be asura to the choletz. Hainu time lotani. Why the Mishnah only end with aim ima and not give us aim ima? Mishum de kaboila misli seifa va'achim mutar. The Tana wanted to teach us in the seifa that the brothers of the choletz are allowed to marry the krovos of the chalutza. Only the choletz himself was not allowed. The relatives, the close relatives of the chalutza. The itana, and if in the Reisha he would have mentioned aim ima havamina, we might have misinterpreted it. Achim mutarim, when it says that the brothers are allowed to marry the krovos of the chalutza, it means dafka aim ima, a great grandmother, Shnios Larai. Samal, the aim ima is the chalutza's grandmother, ube ima, or the chalutza's mother. Lo, we would have thought that the achei al choletz are allowed to marry dafka aim ima, but not a closer relative. The Gemara asks, "V'lisnei aim ima." If you're worried about a misunderstanding, say explicitly that the choletz is also to aim ima, the great grandmother of his wife, and then v'lisnei ha'achim mutar b'kula. As by adding aim ima, and then you add that the achim are mutar b'kula, you understand that even ima and aim ima, even they are excluded as far as the achei chalutza, achei choletz. Kasha, the Gemara doesn't have an answer to this question. Toshma. I'm trying to prove now that Gozru Shnios Bechalutza. The Mishnah says he asura bi aviv ubavi aviv. She's not allowed to marry the father of the cholitz, nor the grandfather of the cholitz. Onimnia avi aviv. My love, mishum cholitz. The subject of the Mishnah is cholitz. As a result of chalitza, we have an iser of the krovos of the chalutza. And on this list, or the other way around, the krovos, the krovim of the cholitz, is avi aviv. Tahavile kalas bino. Right, avi aviv is kalas bino. Now, avi aviv is a din of shnius l'arayis d'Rabbanan. And if they prohibited it to the chalutza, we see that there's a gzeir of shnios in chalutza. So the Gemara rejects this. No, she's not asura machmas acholitz, but mishum misna, misana, gavi lekalas beno. So the listing here in the Mishnah is an integration of two different categories. There are categories that have nothing to do with shnios whatsoever, that don't rise, and then there are others that might be shnios, but you can't prove anything. You can't prove that they would go on shnios from the case of avi aviv, which is kalas beno, and that's a dorais. Gemara continues to bring a rai from the Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah, ube ben beno, like the grandson of the cholitz, my love, mishum cholitz. Again, once again, we're talking about the Isa because of chalitza. Davile eshes avi aviv, and that's shnios. So Gemara says, lo. She's not asurabo mishum cholitz, but rather ben beno shel cholitz mishum misana, v'havi le eshes achi avi aviv. In other words, it's because of her late husband, has nothing to do with the chalitza and the cholitz. She was married to that man, and he is eshes achi avi aviv. So that's shnios, but it's not shnios because of chalitza. So Gemara asks, is this really possible to maintain that her Easter is because of the deceased, her former husband or late husband, Eishes Achi Avi Aviv, but Meimar Machshir, Eishes Achi Avi Aviv. We pass like a Meimar, back on Daf Chaf Aleph, and a Meimar says that there's no problem with Eishes Achi Avi Aviv. So the Gemara answers, "Meimar Mukila Bibar Brod Saba," which is the Ben Beno Shal Saba, who is the Avi Hames V'Acholitz. Sharei Shonidu B'Reish Shalom Mishnah Shiasura B'Aviv V'Acher Kach Hosifu Shiasura Af B'Bno V'Hainu B'No Shal Aviv Hasaba. Asura lachei mes v'acholitz shemisha cholatz. One of the brothers gave chalitza nesu l'shara acher, and that's a lav of lo yivne. Even shabana shuv lo yivne. Ve'achar kach hosifu she'asura af beben beno shel aviv hasaba. leben achia mes ve'acholetz mishumeishes achiyom. So Gemara immediately asks, Ihachi Hainu Achiv ben Achiv. Why the Mishnah have to say it twice? And Gemara rejects it. Tana Achiv ben Achiv shalacholetz min ha'av. Uktani Achiv ben Achiv min ha'em. Kigon shameis v'acholetz hayu achim min ha'av u'min ha'em v'lohem ach nosaf min ha'em v'lo min ha'av. Shachalutza asura liach ze machmas hames v'fishi eches ach shelo b'makom mitzvah. Sharehu ach bailo me'em v'lo me'av. V'lo hutar klali yivo. Who Iser erva min haTorah can asur libno shalach zeh mishum Iser eshes achi ha'av min ha'em sheisur machmas shnios d'rabbanan ach eina Iser machmas hacholetz ala machmas hameis v'gozu bo shnios kevon shehi min asuin v'ein raya im gozu shnios b'chalutza. Toshma, the Tani Rabbi Chia, Arba mi divrei Torah, the Arba mi divrei Sofer. There are 4 krovim that are prohibited to marry the chalutza, and their Isur is not a result of chalitza, but rather because of the deceased. Shahoisa Eishes Hames, she was married to the deceased. And these are Midivrei Torah. Then there are 4 krovim that are prohibited to marry the chalutza, Midivrei Sofer, which are Mina Torah. Av, the father of the choletz, that's Kaloso. Beno, the son of the choletz, who is Achi Aviv, and Bailas Achi Aviv, and now we're talking about Eishes Achi Aviv. Then we have Achiv Shel HaCholetz, who's the Achi Ames, and Kevan Shecholetz Lo Echem Ben Achim, Ari Charachim Omdu Be'iso Lav Shel Asher Lo Yivne. Kevan Shel Bona Shel Lo Yivne. Uben Achiv, the son of the brother of the choletz, is not allowed to marry the chaluta because of Achi Aviv Shalames, which is Eishes Achi Aviv. All that is Midivrei Torah. Which are Midivrei Sofrim? Avi Aviv Shalacholetz, the Avi Imo Shalacholetz. All these are Shnios. And we assume that these categories of Isra are generated by the choletz. That the chalutz is considered kalas beno, uben beno, the grandson of the choletz, is prohibited from marrying the chalutz midin shnios larayos, and the Isra is machmas hacholetz. Uben bito, that's also ben bito shel choletz, likewise midin shnios. It's all midivrei sofer. Ktani mia, we see clearly avi aviv, and we have to assume I love mishum choletz. Avilei kalas beno, which is midin shnios. Right, the father's father-in-law is only midin shnios. So Gemara says, lo, mishum misna. This has nothing to do with the chalita. This is an Isra generated by the deceased, the late brother or husband of this woman. Da'avi lo kalas, no. The chalutza is kalas bino. She was married to Ben Bino Shemes, and the Torah prohibited her midin shnios mishum kalosa, which is an Isur Torah. Tashma avi imo shalacholetz, my love mishum choletz v'havile kalas bito, which is only shnios larayos. It's pretty much a repeat of what we just had. Lo mishum misna. It's because of the deceased brother, her former husband. Ta'avilei kalas bito. That the chaluta is like kalas bito, who is nesua leben bito shemes. Because who bechnios mishum kalas bino. So the Isur here is not because of chalitza generated by chalitza, but rather by shnios larayos in the case of nesua. So we still don't have any clear proof that Rabbanu goes to shnios in chalutza. Toshma, we learned in the words of Rabbi Chia, uben bino, and the Gemara clarifies, my love, who is this Isur incumbent upon? Mishum choletz. What does that mean, Mishum choletz? Shechshivu es ha-choletz ki'ilu nas'a vegirsha. Havi law, this chalutz is Eshes Avi Aviv, which is Osir Midin Shnios. So we see clearly that they would go there Shnios and chalutza. The Gemara rejects it. Lo, Mishum Misna, the Avi Le Eshes Achi Avi Aviv. You want to ask the following question: is it possible that Isura Machmas Hames from Meimar Machshir be Eshes Achi Avi Aviv? And we don't have a Gzeir of Shnios. So certainly the Isur in Ben Bino is got to be because of the Choletz. There's no other way out. Which means the Isur of Eshes Avi Aviv. And this Isur is midin shnios. So you see, they would go to shnios bechalutza. And where it says hamimar, who's matir eshes achi aviv, achi avi aviv, is mukim la mishum choletz. Kasavar shegazru shnios bechalutza. In other words, they were machshiv the chalutza as if the cholet had married her and divorced her, and she's asur leben bino shel cholet mishum eshes avi aviv. It's kasavar gozu shnios bechalutza. So we finally have one clear-cut proof that, according to this Madyomer, gozu shnios bechalutza. Now the Gemara continues to clarify the opinion of those who rejected Amemar. And they hold that Eshes Achi Avi Aviv is Asura. And according to their opinion, it can be Mam in the Mishnah that prohibits Ben Bino Machmas Hames, Eshes Achi Avi Aviv. In Cain, Ha'im yesh shnios bechalutza lav, Toshma, from the words of Rabbi Chia, Ben Bito, my love, mishum choletz. Right, they were machshir the choletz like it's his wife who he divorced. V'havi la, this chalutz is eshes avi imo. And that's Shnios Larais. And the Gemara again rejects the lo michu misna, the havi law, eshes achi avi imo. So we have no proof that they would go to Shnios bechalutza. The Gemara has the following kasha, v'chagabi Shnios da'arayos lo gozru. He says in a regular situation, there was no gzera to prohibit marrying the wife of Achi Avi Imo, of his great uncle. So how can you possibly say that the Isser ben Bito is because of the mess? El Mishum Cholitz. There's only one possibility, that the Isser is because of Chalitza. Umishum Isser Eshes Avi Imo, Bi'afshu Shnios, Ushmamino Gozu Shnios Bechalutza, Shmamino. So you get the impression that this is the last final statement of the Gemara that nobody would argue about. We don't know of any dissenting opinion. Mami. The Mishnah says, Mutar Adam Bekrovas Saras Chalutzoso. The Asur Bitsaras Krovas Chalutzoso. So it's one thing when you're talking about the krovos of the Tsaras Chalutza, but if you're talking about the Tsaras Chalutza herself, that's prohibited. Omer of Tuvi bar Kisam Shmuel, Echad Achim Abol Tsaras Chalutza. So let's say Shimon has two daughters, Sarah and Rivka. Shimon dies. Tzrichos Nishosav. The final maskana is that Gazru Shnios Bechalutza. That's the sikum, the summary of what we learned until now. And then the Mishnah says, Mutar Adam Amar Tovi Bar Kisna Amar Shmuel with regard to the Krovos of Chalutzaso, as opposed to the Tsaras of Krovos Chalutzaso. Echad Ha'achim Haba Al Tsaras Chalutzaso. Let's say Shimon was married to two wives, Sarah and Rivka. Shimon dies without children, and his wives, Sarah and Rivka, fall for Yibma Chalitza. Ruvain, the brother of Shimon, gives Chalitza to Sarah, and Rivka, her Sarah, is now Asura. She is prohibited to Ruvain the Cholitz. Now, one of the brothers has a relationship with Rivka, who is the Tsaras Chalutza, Avlad Mamta. So the Gemara explains, my timer, why is the Vlad Mamzer? And the answer is Bisura Kaima. Before the Chalitza, she was in an Iser of Eshes Ach. And even after the Chalutza to Hatzara, she remains in that state of Iser, namely Iser Eshes Ach, which is an Iser Kares, and the Vlad of Chavi Krisus is a Mamzer. So only the Chalutza had a heter on the Iser Eshes Ach after the Chalitza. And then it's only an Iser La of Lo Yiv. But as far as Hatzar is concerned, the Tsaras Chalutza remains in that state of an Iser Eshes Ach. And now Rav Yosef is going to come along in the next part of this Gemara. He's going to prove from our Mishnah that Soras Chalutza remains in the Isser Veishas Ach, which is an Isser Kari. So Rav Yosef Hamanana, from our Mishnah, I'm going to derive this conclusion. We learned in our Mishnah, Mutar Adam Bekrovas Soras Chalutzoso. A person is allowed to marry the Krova of Tsaras Chalutzos. He's also in the Chalutza and Hatzara, but not, and in the Krova, but as far as the Krova of not the Chaluta herself, but the Tsaras Chalutza, Muteres. Rav Yosef explains, Iyamri Pishlema Tsara, the Tsara of Chalutza, Abroi, meaning she stands outside. Abroi means bachutz. And she's not considered a chalutza, meaning that the chalutza did not receive chalutza or participate in chalutza as a shlichus for her tzara or her many tzaros, and therefore the tzara remains in the state of an Isser Eishes Ach. And now we can understand Mishum Hachi Mutar B'Achotza. That's why we learned that a person is allowed to marry the Achos Tzaras Chalutzaso, because since the tzara is not considered like a chalutza, therefore the Rabbanan did not institute the Gzera to prohibit the krovos of the tzaras Chalutzaso. That the status of the din of tzaras Chalutzaso is identical to the chalutza, as if to say that the chalutza received or participated in chalitza as an agent, as representative of hatzaros, then and therefore ein ba isur karetz, there would only be an isur lav of lo yivna. Then, if that be the case, amay mutter, why would a person be permitted for the krovas tzaras chalutzasa? We should make a gzera of an isur krovos, just like we made a gzera on the chalutza to prohibit our krovos. The same gzera should be extended and applied to tzaras chalutzasa. We have no choice but to conclude, says Rav Yosef, that the chalutza or the chalitza of the chalutza is not a ma'aser shlichus on behalf of the tzaros, and the tzaros remain in the Isser Eishes Ach, which gives them kares, and therefore ba'aleim, if one of the achim has a relationship with her, it's a chiyuv kares with a mamzeres. So Gemara asks Leimet Hevi Tiyuv to Rabbi Yochanan. The Omer Rabbi Yochanan. This is a Gemara back on Daf Yudam in Beis. That if a man gives chalitza to his Yevamot, and then he has a relationship with her or with her tzara, bein achim, whether it's he or one of the brothers, whether it's the chalitz himself or one of the other Yevamim, the brothers, ein chayavim lo ala chalutza kares, v'lo al tzarasa kares. In other words, the chalitz is a representative and a shliach on behalf of his brothers. The chalutza shenechlitza, therefore, is receiving chalitza as a shlucha, as a shlichus of hatzaros. And that's going to be mafkia, the Isser Eishes Ach. There's no kares. There's only a lav of lo yivne. And since lo, right, came in Shabbat l'shul yivne, since we're only dealing with a lav, and our Mishnah, according to the proof of Rav Yosef, is going to prove to us that the chalutza is not doing the chalitza as a shlichus for the tzaros, and therefore there should be an Isser Eishes Ach and a chiyuv kares. How could Rabbi Yochanan reduce it down to an Isser lav of Kevin Shalabana of lo yivne? And the Gemara rejects this now to defend Rabbi Yochanan from this kasha from the Mishnah. Amalecha Rabbi Yochanan v'tizbara. Are you convinced in your logic that the raya that Rav Yosef adduced from our Mishnah is a real bona fide, reliable raya, and that the Isra Achos Chalutza is Da'oraisa, and therefore you ask the kasha, well, if the tzara would be like a Chalutza, then there should be an Isra even on the Achos Tzaras Chalutza, like Achos Chalutza, the Amar Eish Lakish, later on the Mishnah, Kan Shana Rebbe, with regard to this Isser of marrying Achos Grusha, Midivrei Torah, the Isser of marrying the sister of your wife who's now a Grusha is a Doraisa, and the Isser to be Choletz, on the Choletz, to marry the Achos Chalutza is only Midivrei Sofrin. We see that there's no Isser Achos Chalutza on a Doraisa level, it's only D'Rabbanan. So in the Chalutza herself, they made a Gzera to prohibit the Achosa, but Sarasa, they never made that Gzera. And even if you would argue that Sarah is like the Chalutza, but Ein Achosa Asura, her sister would not be Asura. So therefore, let's say we should answer that the Chalutza does Enochinami, the Chalitza, as a Shliach for the Tsaros, but they too are not Omdos, they're not included in the Isrei Shesah. They're only Asuras because of the law of Lo Yivne, and there's no Chiv Kares, and our Mishnah could be reconciled with Rabbi Yochanan. The Mishnah says that a person is allowed to marry the Krova of Tsaras Chalutzaso, even though he's Asur, B'tsaras Krovas Chalutzaso. Maishnahai. Why is in the Reisha he's allowed to marry the Krovas Tsaras Chalutzaso, and yet in the Seifa, in the case of Tsaras Krovas Chalutzaso, not Krovas Tsaras Chalutzaso, but Tsaras Krovas Chalutzaso, HaKrova v'Tzaraso Nisuos L'Nochri She'enam Achi Ames, somebody who's not related to the deceased, and nevertheless Asru Es Tzarasva. The Gemara answers that the derech is that Krovos Chalutza Holchos Im HaCholetzes LeBezdin Kisha Choletzes Ukshe Leah Choletzes Holeches Ima Rachel. Rachel accompanies her sister to Bezdin, and maybe the people don't know which one was the Choletzes, which one was the Chalutza. And there are some who make a mistake. They think that Rachel was the Chalutza. So therefore, if we matir marrying Tsaras Rachel, who is a Tsaras Krovas Chalutza, so people mistakenly conclude that Mutalisa is Tsaras Chalutza. They're going to think that Rachel and Atzara are the wives of the mess. Rachel was the Choletzes. Therefore, Hachti Azla Ba'adola Beidina, she who accompanies the Choletzes to Bezdin, Gazru Barabanan Shetzarasa Asura, so that we should avoid any mistake. But the Krova of Tsaras Chalutza, lo Gazru Beirabanan, because Tsaras HaYevama, since she is lo Ozla Ba'adola Bezdin, it's not the derech for the Yevama who is not Choletzes to go with the Yevama who is Choletzes into Bezdin. No one's going to make a mistake and think that she's the Chalutza. She doesn't show up in Bezdin. And therefore, if he marries her Krovos, they're not going to make a mistake into thinking that he was marrying Achos Chalutzaso, who's Asura. And therefore, lo Gazu Be'Rabban. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of Daf Mem Aleph, Omen Aleph, which in Yirtzeh Hashem we will pick up after Yom Tov. Thank you so much.